Welcome to a survey of the history of science. During the next 36 lectures, we're going to go on a journey that stretches from the ancient Babylonians of the second millennium BC all the way down to the England of Sir Isaac Newton around 1700. Along the way, we're going to meet lots of fascinating people and visit fascinating places, and hopefully we'll get some of these people to share their engaging stories with us. The kind of locales we're going to visit? Well, everything from the Nile Delta to classical Greece, Rome, the Middle Ages, down to the Renaissance and the 17th century. We'll meet places that are familiar and unfamiliar. But every journey requires some preparation. And most people find that in going on a journey, they appreciate it more, they learn more, they get more out of it if there's a little bit of preparation before they leave home. So that's what we're going to do in this lecture. We're going to prepare for this journey through the history of science. Before I do that, though, perhaps I should spend a few minutes saying about why the history of science is important in the first place. Perhaps it's unnecessary for me to do that, since you've obviously already invested in this course, so you're going to have to listen to me anyway. But bear with me for a moment, because I think there's some important things to be said. Look around yourselves right now and think about the impact of science and technology on the modern world. Right now you're listening to my voice and perhaps seeing my image through a technology that's commonplace. You use it every day. But 60 years ago was completely unknown. Science and technology allows us on a daily basis to zoom around the surface of our planet at breakneck speeds, even to fly through the air to its furthest corners. Scientific information now beams down invisibly and silently to us from the depths of space, from machines that we've built and launched into voyages to distant planets. Nowadays, we know about all kinds of things, or maybe we flatter ourselves into thinking that we know about all kinds of things, such as the birth and the death of stars, to the invisible submicroscopic rearrangements of the molecules going on within our bodies at every moment. We look to science with varying degrees of confidence to solve our problems. Around the globe, right at this moment, tens or hundreds of thousands of scientists are busily engaged in a wide variety of projects, expending millions of hours, billions of dollars, while thousands of students are eagerly training to join their ranks. At every moment, science and technology impacts on our lives in so many levels. We literally cannot escape it any longer. And that itself is a remarkable, but indeed a bit of a frightening thought as well. Well, I don't need to go any further in this way. What I would urge you to do is maybe spend the rest of today making a mental note of every time your life depends upon science and technology. And you can be surprised at how much science and technology directs things. In fact, I think it's no exaggeration to say that science and technology are very high on a very short list of the most important factors influencing, even directing, our lives as individuals and as a culture. Well, if this is so, doesn't it seem essential to understand the background to our current scientifically based society? How and why did things turn out this way? Were there other options? How were things different or the same in earlier time periods in different civilizations? How, when, and by whom were scientific discoveries made? And more importantly, why were they made? What are the ways in which science and society have interacted? Well, it's questions like these that undergird the entire enterprise of the history of science. Now, the history of science is actually a fairly young discipline. Its professionalization dates only from the 20th century, and the founders of the discipline, seeing how important science and technology was to the development of human culture, realized that traditional history, which traditionally focuses on economic, political, military, social factors, might in fact be missing a very important dimension, an explanatory principle to account for the historical development of culture. So we come now to a beguilingly simple question, as many simple questions are. What is science? If we're going to study for the next 18 hours something called the history of science, perhaps it would be a good idea to have more or less of an idea what science actually is. Now, I think if I were to ask people, you would all have more or less of an idea of what science is, some sort of a definition. But the definitions that we give to something like that are automatically determined by our own experiences. And of course, anything that is close to us, whether that's physically or temporally, always looms the largest. Therefore, our definition of science is going to be a definition of modern science. The definitions we give will be drawn from features familiar to us in current day science. We might point to the use of mathematical models or mathematical tools, to a more or less well-defined scientific method, or something having to do with precision or methods of proof or certainty. But you see, here's where the problem arises. Those features may not in fact be essential to science. Science as we know it might have turned out differently. Its character and its method was not inscribed on tablets handed down from the heavens. Nor is it somehow encoded in our DNA. Science is a human activity. We've been developing it as we go along, not following some pre-written blueprint. One point of the history of science is to determine how and why the features we recognize in science came to be as they are. Therefore, if we use features familiar in modern science in order to identify what counts as science in the past, then our work is hopelessly circular, and we end up learning nothing. In short, it makes no sense to go looking for the prototypes of the modern scientist in ancient Greece, in the Middle Ages, in the 17th century. We're not going to find them there. Or we will find interesting people, and then we'll end up making caricatures out of them by picking and choosing out the points that seem familiar, or cutting them down to make them seem familiar, and then jettisoning the rest. Well, that kind of a historical approach of making our past figures look modern is sometimes called Whig history. It picks and chooses those bits out of the historical landscape that fit modern definitions that we impose on the past. And in the history of science, that means magnifying the historical features, whether characters, theories, ideas, which can be linked most closely to currently accepted modern scientific ideas and persons, while ignoring the rest. This is a trap to be avoided. Let me try and illustrate this a little bit better by reminding you that we're going on a journey. So imagine for a moment, imagine a traveler who takes with him the definitions and evaluations of things he devised within the narrow confines of his own hometown. Let's say he travels to France. He's in France now, and in due course he gets hungry, so he begins to look for food. Well, to him, back at home, food means fast food. So he searches around France for McDonald's, let's say. He has to search a long time, but eventually he finds one or another, but many, many fewer than he's used to. Since he hasn't bothered to learn the local language and doesn't care to expand his horizons by coming to know the natives, these are the only places he finds to eat. So what does he conclude when he gets home from his trip? That in France, the food is just like the food at home, except there's a whole lot less of it. So the French must not be as advanced in regard to food or as interested in food. Well, he's missed the entire point of travel. For travel, like historical inquiry, is most valuable when it expands our horizons. It teaches us new things and new perspectives. It forces us to question our assumptions, and it urges us to discover and even adopt new things that we might have never heard of before that seem more satisfying to us. Well, let's now return to the definition of science. It surprises a lot of people to learn that the current definition we give to the word science is actually a development that's quite recent. It's a 19th century development. And as for the word scientist, it has an interesting history. We know exactly when it was coined, 1834. and we know who did it as well. It was done by William Whewell, an important thinker, philosopher of the 19th century, by making an analogy, art, science, artist, scientist. He did it, though, with tongue firmly planted in cheek. It turns out that the members of the British Association for the Advancement of Science were concerned because they didn't know what to call themselves anymore. And so Whewell made this jocular suggestion to them of the word scientist. A lot of people found the word funny or dissonant. In fact, as late as 1894, Thomas Henry Huxley, who's famed as Darwin's bulldog for his adoption and defense of Darwinian evolution, in 1894 Huxley said that the word scientist is about as pleasing a word as electrocution. And even in the early 20th century, the scientist's journal Nature refused to use the word in print. Many English thinkers thought that it was a vulgar Americanism. They apparently forgot that it was actually an Englishman who came up with the word, but somehow the word stuck. And it happened hand in hand with the development of the profession of science. So science takes on a new meaning. It's not just knowledge, which is what its definition, its original etymology is. It's from the Latin scientia, for knowledge, not knowledge, know-how, mind you, but knowledge, understanding of a thing. Science somehow got reduced, and it got reduced at about the same time, and for probably many of the same reasons that scientists became a professionalized class of people. And this happened in the 19th century. Well, nowadays, science isn't just a body of knowledge. It's not just scientia anymore. It's a process and it's an activity as well. Well, we can't just go back and use the original meaning of the word because it's too broad. This is not going to be a course on the history of knowledge. So what were there before there were 19th century scientists? That is to say, imagine you lived in 1750 and you were interested in studying plants or planets or chemical processes. How would you get introduced at a cocktail party? Chances are you'd be introduced as a natural philosopher, a term which was still preferred by many people down to the end of the 19th century. Your field of interest would then be natural philosophy, the adjective natural distinguishing you from a regular philosopher who might be interested in ethics or other kinds of philosophical topics. And that adjective does so by specifying the domain of your activity as nature. Now, I'm going to use these two terms, natural philosophy, natural philosopher, quite a lot in this course. I'm not going to be too rigorous about it, but what I want you to do is remember the reason I'm using these terms is it's twofold. One, I want to remind you that the people we're looking at are not scientists in the modern sense of the term, by and large. They have different ideas, different functions, different questions. But also the realm of the natural philosopher is different in subtle ways from that of the modern scientist. As we shall see, the natural philosophers tended not to be as specialized, for one thing. They also were certainly not professionalized as a professional class. There is no class of scientist, say in the Middle Ages. They also tended to ask questions that modern scientists would either never think of or not care about. But the old term natural philosopher suggests a definition that's very simple and very broad for science that I think is going to serve us very well for the purposes of this course. And here it is. Don't expect anything profound. I said it's simple and broad. Science is the study of the natural world. Simple enough. Science's link to the natural world differentiates it from many other creative human endeavors, because science ends up to be dependent upon two quite different things. It is dependent first on human culture, but it's also dependent upon the external reality of the natural world. Now, the dependence upon the natural world means that we can't just make things up as we go along. Science is supposed to have some kind of connection to the reality of the natural world. And most people do believe that there's a reality outside of ourselves. Science is our attempt to engage with it, to describe it, to understand it. Science has to confront what exists in the natural world. Now, many of the definitions of the words in that previous sentence science has to confront what exists in the natural world have changed over time. But nonetheless, I want you to see science as something that has some kind of relationship to this natural world. However, science is also a human activity because the world is seen through human eyes and processed through human minds, minds that are developed and conditioned by human society. The natural world doesn't write our history book, the natural world does not write our science textbooks for us. People write the science textbooks. Therefore, while the natural world is not a human creation, our descriptions of it and our perceptions of it have to be. Let me give you another metaphor based on the idea of a journey. Imagine for a moment a crowd of people standing around admiring an immense, beautifully and intricately designed and decorated building. Let's say the Palace of Versailles. Now, ask each one of them independently for a description of what they saw. It'll come as no surprise that each person gives a slightly different description. No two will be identical, even though all of the people were looking at the same building. Each person will make choices of features of particular interest to him and will see and interpret things according to his own unique mind and dispositions. A priest, for example, might speak most about the chapel and see religious symbolism where others don't. A mathematician might focus on the geometry of the architecture and notice symmetries and proportions which may or may not have been in the mind of the original architect. A gardener might make mention of things nobody noticed, like curious plants growing out of cracks in the wall. You can also be sure that a 19th century group of people would describe it differently from a 21st century group of people. So science is dependent upon both the reality of the natural world, the thing described, and the societal context of the scientist, the thing doing the describing. So we should avoid views that diminish the importance of either one of these two parents to science. Now, some accounts of the history of science, particularly older ones and popularized ones, have downplayed the human context and envisioned a gradual emergence of humanity from the darkness of ignorance into the light of science. The truths of science were progressively unveiled. Now, the tone of this story is heroic and triumphal, and as such, it's sometimes called triumphalism. The path of the development of science is predetermined by the natural world. Science is out there, and we just have to go out and collect it. But triumphalism does not take into account the human agency. And like Whiggism, it assumes that past figures had our questions and our interests and our outlooks. And it very easily leads to an arrogant and self-serving view that somehow we're just smarter than those silly ancestors of ours who couldn't see what we see so clearly. I know of no evidence that the average intelligence of humanity has increased during the past 3 millennia. If anything, it might be the opposite. Aristotle, Ptolemy, St. Thomas Aquinas, Johannes Kepler, and countless others, whose names we don't even know, were just as intelligent as anyone alive today. Now, it's true that they stood upon much smaller bases, much smaller foundations of accumulated information. But they were not deluded or stupid or foolish. They were not sleepwalkers or somehow blind to what was before their eyes. At least no more than anyone today is. Indeed, our goal in the history of science should be to understand our historical figures in their proper context and try to see things as they saw them with their sensibility and interests, not to make them look like us and jeer at them when they somehow fail to uncover things or describe things the way we do, or fail to share our concerns, our ways, and our sets of priorities. Now remember, again, we're on a journey, and there's a not very attractive name for the kind of people who journey into a foreign land, in this case the past, where they scoff at the ways of the locals and expect things everywhere to be the way they are at home. Don't be one of those. Well, at the other end of the spectrum, is a more recent trend, which in its strongest form sees science as an entirely human invention. Its content is not dependent ultimately upon an external reality of the natural world, but is instead an artifact of human society. This view is known as social constructivism. Just as the triumphalist view has been favored by those trying to build up the modern mystique of science, the social constructivist view tends to be particularly favored by those who wish to question or tear down the mystique of science. The problem is, of course, that it fails to recognize the existence of a natural reality that commands the attention of the natural philosopher and the modern scientist. And it doesn't recognize the real desire of these people as human agents to arrive at an understanding of that external world. It tends to view, unfortunately, such figures not, say, as sleepwalkers, but rather as the manipulators and the manipulated of society. Well, I would advise you to eschew both extremes and warn you to be on the lookout for such views or the hints of such views in your readings. The virtuous middle is the place to stand, with science as the body of constantly developing descriptions of the natural world made by human beings directed by their context within human society. Thus, simply stated, the history of science is the study of a broad variety of ways developed and practiced at different times by different practitioners, by different cultures, for studying, conceptualizing, and trying to make sense of the natural world. It includes also the different attitudes towards the natural world that are held by different thinkers at different times. And it should pay particular attention to the contexts in which studies of the natural world are actually pursued. Most of all, it strives to understand the historical actors. Thus, to do the history of science properly in this course, I often will have to take time to explain natural phenomena with which you might not be so familiar. The apparent motions of the heavenly bodies, for example, the properties of certain metals, the things about certain types of plants and animals. In short, some science. But I'm also going to have to spend time explaining the cultural contexts, the philosophical and theological commitments of the people who tried to give accounts, to try to explain, to try to understand these phenomena. What's so important to understand in dealing with the history of science is that we have to cast a really wide net, a very, very wide net in order to capture the history of science. It very often develops in directions and ways and places and from influences and factors that don't fit the modern definition or ideas about science. Thus, be prepared right now to deal with many topics that at present you might not think appertain very closely at all to scientific issues, but in fact, we'll see they do. We would miss a great deal otherwise if we restricted our vision too much, if we didn't cast a really wide net. What you shouldn't expect from this course, this journey, is some sort of a chronology of scientific firsts, or a linear progression from the Bronze Age to the Space Age. Expect instead to spend time trying to understand a wide variety of people and their cultures, what they thought and why they thought it. We really want to get to know the locals here. We want to endeavor to see things from their perspectives. That's the only way we really come to understand them. Who knows? We might even find that these people in this foreign country, the past, had some insights and viewpoints that we might choose to revive and adopt. We might find them very comfortable to us. Well, I have to now make a slight apology. We cannot possibly cover all the necessary material in this course, and therefore I've had to implement certain criteria of selection. If you look over the next 36 lectures, pick any one of them, and we could do an entire course of 36 lectures on each one. So we're going to go at a bit of a breakneck speed. If I can continue the journey metaphor one more time, this is sort of the history of science version of the 6 countries in 10 days kind of package tour. What I'm going to hope is that I give you a roadmap, I give you a plan, I let you see what's out there so that when you find things that particularly interest you, you can go back and look at them more deeply. And we have a reading list here to help you do that. Let me say what some of the criteria of selection are. We're going to focus on natural philosophy and to a lesser extent technology in the Western world, defining the Western world as those cultures that are the immediate heirs to Greek thought, so Europe and the Middle East. We're also going to talk to some extent, but not to a large extent, about the history of mathematics and the history of medicine. We're going to include those only where they impact on the history of science most importantly. The history of education is another thing that's going to come up at several junctures because it's through education that scientific traditions are passed down from generation to generation. And that's just as important among the Greeks and the medievals as it is in the modern age. I've divided the course into 3 sections on roughly chronological grounds. The first section deals with the ancient world, from the Babylonians about the 2nd millennium BC up to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, say around 500 AD. In this section, ancient philosophy, the ways of conceptualizing the natural world and thinking about man's place within it, is crucial. It's crucial for the development of the study of nature. And so engagement with the ancient sources that are described in the first set of 12 lectures actually persists through the next 24. And you will see that all the rest, most of the other lectures after we get away from the ancient world, will at one point or another keep referring back to what happens in the ancient world. So the intellectual foundations of natural philosophy in the West, and one could say of modern science today, lie ultimately in classical Greek thought. Classical Greek thought, of course, greatly enlarged, greatly developed over the intervening 2,000 years, but nonetheless, many of the foundations of the way we look at the world are set there. The second section deals with the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1400, 1450 AD, and we'll look at it in 2 places, in the Islamic world and in the Christian world. The interactions of these 2 great monotheistic world religions with both the classical tradition and the natural world, and to a lesser extent with each other, is central to this time period. And what I need to say straight away at this point is a caveat for you. The relationship between science and religion is very complex and very interesting. What I want to get away from, what I want to warn you against, is not to think that there's some kind of inherent conflict between science and religion. That is really a product largely of the 19th century. It was a politically motivated development, politically motivated construction, which has been turned to various political purposes ever since. It's still very common to think that there is some kind of fundamental split, fundamental conflict between science and religion. I'm not going to take time now to try and dissuade you if you believe that. Instead, I'll let the next 35 lectures do that for me. Hopefully, you will, when I come back to sum up in lecture number 36, I will be preaching to the choir, so to speak. Well, the third section, the third set of 12 lectures, deals with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, roughly 1450 to 1700, 1750. The scientific revolution is a very important concept for the history of science. It's something that was enunciated by 20th century historians of science, and it holds that the modern scientific worldview really gelled, really came together in a period between the publication of Copernicus's work on heliocentrism in 1543 and the time of the death of Isaac Newton in 1727. Historians of science argue endlessly about the scientific revolution, what its parameters were, how long it lasted, how deep and how substantial it was. Did it really happen or not? So we're going to use that term scientific revolution because it's clear a lot of stuff happens then. It's a very exciting time. But if you ask 20 historians of science when was the scientific revolution and what was it like, you'll probably get 20 different answers. I'll try to present some historical scenarios, some historical interpretations of the scientific revolution, and then we'll talk about it more as we get to the end of those 12 lectures. What we're going to do now is examine the development, what we're going to do in the scientific revolution is examine the development of new worldviews in contrast to Aristotle and some of the ancient philosophical ideas. Now I've come to the conclusion of my introductory lecture. We're about to set off on our journey. Pack your bags, leave the bad baggage at home, travel light, keep your eyes and ears open, talk to the natives, listen to the natives, try to understand the natives, and have a good time and fun. Good luck on this journey.